So I found an old save here in my East 5, and this is where we're going to actually discuss this. And we've looked at team instructions, or you guys actually asked me to go over team instructions in Football Manager and how they work and how I understand them. So that's what we're going to do in this video. I'm just going to clear out this. Okay, there's no need for that. I'm going to create a new tactic that is completely blank, straight from the off, just to see exactly what we're looking at. And we're not going to be looking at player roles in this video. That's actually going to be for a separate video. When it comes to mentalities, I did also create a video about mentality and how they work in Football Manager, or how I actually interpret them and how I go about applying mentalities. So I'm going to attach a link to that video as well. So in case you want to look at mentalities, we'll not be looking at mentalities here in detail, but they're all mentalities: 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then the one that is balanced in between. And then in a nutshell, mentality is basically how willing your team is to attack or defend. So if you're in the positive mentality, your team is going to attack a little bit while being cautious of their defense. And if your team is playing cautiously, they're going to defend a whole lot and then being open to always counter. Same for when you increase the bar to attacking and very attacking. Very attacking, they're going to be relentlessly trying to score a goal regardless of whatever the situation is. And they're very defensive, they're going to try to shut up shop and not bother about attacking in any way. So it's just like a slider from 0 being balanced, and then -3 -3 is very defensive, +3 is like very attacking. So down to the reason for the video, which is the team instructions. We'll start with the attacking width now. And for me, the attacking width is how, yeah, well, on paper it tells you how wide or how narrow your team is playing, but what I tend to understand is that if you set the attacking width to narrow, while your players are going to somehow shift towards the middle of the field, your wingers will still be wingers, and then your fullbacks will still be fullbacks. You're not going to find them in the central midfield position here. It's not really how it's going to work, but they're going to try their best to try and funnel the ball into the middle of the field. In case you have an attacking midfielder, let's say you have this Leitch guy playing as an attacking midfielder, they will tend to find, oh my goodness, why is he not moving? Okay, I got him to move. So in case you have Leitch as a number 10 in here, the teammates are obviously going to try to pass the ball to Leitch all the time because he's the one that in the number 10 role. That's when your team is playing fairly narrow. But if they're playing wide, and they're going to tend to find the fullbacks and the wingers instead. So not that they're going to neglect all the other players, they will still try to find them, but they're going to do this more than often. So if he's fairly narrow, they're going to try to find the number 10 and they're going to play through him and try to play through balls into the striker, playing it centrally like that. But if you're setting it to fairly wide or even extremely wide, something like this, they're going to try to find the wide players and then try to cross the ball from there. That's kind of how I interpret the way the width works. Now you can also use width in your favor. Like if you're playing a diamond like this, you have a CDM and then one attacking midfield and then you have a diamond. What's going to happen is that if you have a mezzala play in this left hand side, and then you set your passing or your attacking width to fairly wide or wide, your diamond is not going to be so narrow. So your mezzala is going to still try to get into the half spaces and try to go and cross the ball from here. But whereas if you're playing narrowly, the only people that will be finding their, or let's say the half space the mezzala is going to occupy is going to be a lot closer to the box. And then your fullbacks are going to be the players that are going to try to offer that width because they're the only ones out wide. The next one here is pass into space. Pass into space instructs your players to look to make passes into open spaces for players to run into. This sort of works if you're playing with players that are going to overlap one another. Like let's say you have from my understanding, let's say you have an inverted winger in this space here. He is playing as an inverted winger, and then you have a fullback, someone like Mackenzie Lemon, playing as a fullback on attack duty. What's going to happen naturally when these two players are in connection with one another is that Ramsey is going to tend to cut inside and Lemon is going to tend to overlap. So the player that is playing in this role, let's say Newton is going to play as an advanced playmaker, just for example. Newton would tend to play the ball into the space where Ramsey has vacated, even if Lemon is not yet in that space. So what's going to happen is that he's going to try to play a through ball in there for Lemon to run into and try to latch onto it. That's like the simple understanding of how pass into space works. Also, it also works for, let's say, central defenders or a super keeper, for example. But let's use central defenders playing a ball, playing defender DT, or even a no-nonsense centre back. This player is going to tend to play long balls into open spaces, expecting that the players that are playing as a winger in attack, for example, they will get ahead and try to latch onto that ball. So he's not going to be forced to play the ball directly to another player. He can take that advantage of playing the ball into open spaces so that the winger or the inverted winger or even a striker can run onto that ball and try and meet it and then continue the attack. Under approach play, we also have a lot of other instructions here which kind of defines a tactical system. I'm going to start from playing out from the back. Now, depending on how depending on how you go about playing Football Manager, playing out from the back is quite unique, because if you have two players that are, like you say, you have a no-nonsense centre-back and then a ball-playing defender, for example, people might say, okay, this is quite adventurous, that these players are not going to obey the instruction of playing out of defense, but that's not really the case. So what's going to happen is that play out of defense encourages your defenders to pass their way out rather than hoofing the ball long. So even if you have a no-nonsense centre-back, he will tend to do what he likes to do, which is hoofing the ball long. But on occasion, when he notices that there's a player for him to pass the ball to, he would rather play that pass than go on to hit the ball long. He would naturally hit the ball long if there is nobody for him to pass to. So when you go on to select player out of defense, you need to also include the players that are around them, so you can have a DM, somebody that is going to allow your defenders to actually recycle possession and then play out from the back. And it also goes down to including even your defensive midfielders and your fullbacks. They will not look to launch balls over the top and try to start fast counterattacks. They will look to play the ball among themselves and try and pass it out of the defense that way. This is safer if you're trying to retain possession and you're not looking to give away possession, because in case you play a long ball, it's risky because the opposition can just win the header and then you've lost possession just like that. So if you notice that in most downloaded tactics, for some reason, you will still find play out of defense in there, because it kind of helps your team to, hold on to possession when they have possession. Another way to play out of defense without actually turning on this instruction is to go into your goalkeeper and then ask your goalkeeper to distribute the ball to the centre backs. The issue with this alone is that when he gives the ball to the centre backs, if the centre backs go on to see a player that is in good position in the opposition's territory, they can go on to hit a long pass. But if you have a pass into space instruction selected, those defenders may not rush to hit the ball out. They're going to look to play the ball among themselves and pass their way out of defense, including the defensive midfielder or even the central midfielders. The other two instructions here are the other four instructions. Let's start with the left and right. So if you're focusing the play down the right hand side, in case you do have a strong player here, let's say you have a player in Leitch. Leitch is actually one of my good players in this particular save, but Leitch, let's say he's playing as a winger on attack DT. I'm going to assume that he's a right-footed player. Yes, he is. So let's say he's one of our best players, and then he plays on this wing here. And then the opposition also has a defender that is so solid that is marking Ramsey on the other wing. If you go and focus to play down the right hand side, one thing you're doing is that you're funneling all the ball and all your attacks, all your crosses, all your through balls, trying to use Leitch and trying to use his wing to try and create chances. Also, you're avoiding the powerful defender that is playing on the right hand side of the opposition, which is our left hand side. So you're focusing the play down the right hand side. Also, when it comes to wing, and then you notice that the opposition is quite solid in the middle of the field, like their two center halves are quite solid, but their wingers are quite bad. So you can choose to focus the ball down the left hand and the right hand side. It also works for wing play. If you check the default setting for wing play, it encourages you to move the ball to the left and the right hand side to both of your wingers and then ask the wingers to cross the ball. So that's what focus on play does. If you're playing with a middle of the field like this, it means that you're going to try to pass through the opposition's middle, which is somehow related to the width. I think we've also discussed this when we were talking about the width. But you may ask, is it possible to focusing the play through the middle and playing with a very wide width? That's confusing, but I've seen it work before. What's going to happen in this scenario is that you're going to be channeling all the energy into the middle of the field and then forcing the opposition to try and protect the middle of the field while you've also stretched the pitch wide. In this sense, you'll be using your fullbacks to try and offer that width. So in a way, it kind of works, but it's risky and also confusing sometimes, but it does work. You can actually play through the middle and then have your team play with extremely wide width. There's probably nothing impossible that is in Football Manager anyway. What do we know? The next instructions we're going to look at is overlap and underlap, and I'm going to start with the overlap instructions. So what happens in overlap is, I think I explained something similar to that. In case you have Ramsey playing as an inside forward on support duty, and then you have Mackenzie Lemon play as a fullback on attack duty, or let's just make him a wing back or complete wing back. That's more interesting. If you have a complete wing back, this player is going to tend to get ahead all the time. He's going to look to get ahead. So what's going to happen is that if I have an inverted winger play here on support and then I have a complete wing back on attack DT, these players will naturally overlap themselves. Based on the role that they are playing, they will overlap. So if you're looking for the overlap, it means that you're asking your team to always wait so that when the overlap happens, they can now exploit the overlap. Normally the overlap will happen whether you like it or not, but if you ask your team to look for the overlap, they will constantly. Here's the instruction. Look for the overlap, which means your players are going to constantly hold on to possession and wait for that overlap to happen before they actually take advantage of it. But if you have it unchecked, it means the team doesn't really need to wait. They can play along, and when the overlap comes, they're going to take advantage of it. Same thing on the right. So waiting for the overlap. If I'm using, okay, that's the case where I explain you have a complete wing back that will always get forward. In case we have a fullback on support duty that will choose whether he likes to get forward or not, because he's not required to get forward now. So, and then I go on to turn on, look for the overlap. It means that the fullback is going to remember that, okay, they're waiting for me to actually make this run. So he's going to tend to make that run. So if you have, look for the overlap checked when you have a wing back or a fullback on support duty like this, it will tend to encourage him to get forward and cover that space so he can actually look for that overlap and play the ball through there. With the underlap, it's quite similar to that of the overlap, but what's going to happen with the underlap is that you're not just waiting for a winger. Okay, let's say, okay, I'm tired of using Mackenzie Lemon now. Let me try somebody else in Macintosh. Let's say Macintosh was like an inverted wing back on support DT. What's going to happen is we have a complete, okay, inverted wing back on support DT to somehow operate as a DM or to some extent a central midfielder. He's going to get into the middle of the field. So looking for the overlap, ask your team to try and hold on to possession of the ball until the guy that is a inverted winger on support duty gets into that half space, and then you can actually look to play the ball through to him. You can also have a situation where there is a central midfielder on attack duty. This kind of works too. You have a central midfielder on attack duty here, and he's also going to run into this space, into this half space here. The advanced playmaker on the left hand side could somehow wait for him to make that run, and then he looks to play the ball through and take advantage of the underlap. But usually I'm going to give the best description using the inverted winger, because the central midfielder on attack duty is going to be quite high, so it may not really always apply to him. But an inverted wing back on support duty, a fullback on support duty, or let's say a fullback on attack duty that has the instruction to cut inside with the ball, this guy is going to run into the middle of the field and make those darting runs and try to stay a bit narrow and try to run into this space here. That's where your team is going to hold on to possession for him to make that run and try to get into the central areas, and they're going to look to play it through pass to him to try and continue the attack from there. That's basically my understanding of how the underlap works. It also applies to defensive midfielders. I think there are some defensive midfielder like the Segundo Volante, or the one defensive midfielder likes to run. I think the roaming playmaker, the register is somewhat, he has some roaming from positions, but defensive midfielder on support DT that has the get further forward instruction also has the ability to take advantage of the underlap. Segundo Volante, like I also mentioned, and then of course inverted wing back on support DT. Those players are going to make runs through the middle, so the team is going to try to hold on to possession. When they make those runs through the middle, they'll continue to play with them. Now, the passing directness is another one that comes with a bit of confusion for some people, but for me, I'm going to leave everything here on standard and then leave everything unbalanced. So what happens when you change the mentality? Okay, hold on, let me just disable this, completely not related. If you go on to change the mentality, and what happens when you change the mentality from the balanced mentality to the positive mentality, what happens is that your passing directness automatically shifts to slightly shorter and slightly higher tempo, slightly shorter passing directness. It's the same thing that happens when you change it to attacking or very attacking. Your team is going to have a slightly more direct and much higher tempo by default. From my understanding of the passing directness, it is highly inspired by your team mentality. So in case you have a positive or a balanced mentality like this, your passing directness is to some degree normal. But if you want to play a shorter passing directness like this, your team is going to try to retain possession more often than not. They're going to try to not play risky passes into open spaces, long passes like that. They're going to try to move the ball around with shorter passing among themselves to try and retain possession of the ball, and also try to look for gaps in the opposition's defense to try and break them down. This is suitable for the possession-based style of play. If you take it much shorter, it's just shorter passing but with a bit more shortness in the passing. But after all, is that shorter passing, you try to inspire your team to try and hold on to possession of the ball without wasting possession. But if you want to play an attacking based style of play, a slightly more direct passing directness encourages your team to play the ball faster and more forward. They are covering a lot more distance with the way they are playing, and they're trying to move the ball from back to front as quickly as possible. It's risky because you might go on to lose possession a lot when you're playing this way. And most of them, I think they're also tied to the tempo. So if you go on to increase this again, yeah, you can see that as I go on to increase, even though we're balanced, and then I go on to increase to a much more direct passing, the tempo automatically increases as well. So it's they're tied together one to another. Now with tempo is how quickly your team is going to be willing to make something happen. Just like we saw with the slightly more direct, your team is urgently trying to move the ball forward. So if you're playing a standard directness passing and then you go on to increase your team's tempo, you can see that is that your team is going to try to move the ball out of their defense with more urgency, try to move the ball around themselves much faster to try and tire out the opposition. That's actually written here, unsettle the opposition and tire them out. So in case you have a slightly higher tempo, you can also play a shorter passing directness with a very high tempo. That way your team is going to be knocking the ball around themselves with the emphasis of retaining possession, but they're doing it very quickly. That way they're going to tire out the opposition. To some extent they might tire out themselves, but they're going to try to tire out the opposition and try to break them down and shift them across side to side very quickly. So that kind of creates gaps for your team in the opposition's defense to try and break them down and score. Most very good systems try to operate with a very high tempo and shorter passing, try and retain that possession of the ball and also do it quickly in a way that the opposition cannot really catch up with what you're doing. So last but not the least, for in possession instruction, I think I'm going to make a separate video for in transition instruction. It might be much shorter. But for the final third, when your team is trying to cross the ball, this is mixed crossing, float crossing, whip crosses, low crosses. For floated crosses, it tends to work for target men or for strikers that are quite tall. If you have a tall striker, or in case by any means necessary, you did go on to ask your center back to get into the box and act like a second striker, yes, you can use the floated crosses. But if you don't have tall strikers, floated crosses might not really work for you because the goalkeeper has an advantage when you're playing floated crosses. For whip crossing, you try to ask your fullbacks or your wingers to try and drive the ball into the box with speed. This is going to make it harder for taller strikers to try and latch onto the ball, but for some instance you may actually get a rare scenario where your striker actually gets the ball. But it's usually for faster strikers that can react quicker than the defenders, so you can play whip crosses for them. Low crosses, on the other hand, tends to work a lot well in Football Manager. I don't know why that's the case, but low crosses tends to allow your team or encourage your team to make a cutback. So the kind of thing that Man City normally does, they're going to run to the byline and try to knock the ball out like a square pass into the box, like a sweaty FIFA goal, something like that. Low crosses do work that way. That's kind of how, and you trust it because most strikers aren't always 6'4" all the time. And since people like to play with a slightly higher tempo, the low crosses does work when you get into the byline. You can just square it back for somebody to tap it in. You can even get goals from the striker or from the, what's the other guy's name, from the central midfielder on attack duty that's going to be running into the box. You can kind of score goals using low crosses, but if you're floating the crosses, for some reason your central midfielder has to be a very tall player that can actually get into the box in time, try and latch onto that ball. That is, you're playing floated crosses, but low crosses kind of works well. Anybody can just get into the box and score a tap in. Walk the ball into the box instruction works like shorter passing, but in the opposition's territory. So it's different from short passing in the sense that you can actually play a slightly more direct style of play, and then you have walk the ball into the box instruction turned on. What this is going to do is that as much as you try to move the ball into the opposition's territory quickly, when you're in the opposition's territory, you're not going to try to force a goal. You're going to try to actually build your way into scoring. That's how complicated Football Manager has become. Apparently, you can normally, if I have this pulled all the way to, okay, if you go all the way to much more direct, you can no longer play a walk the ball into the box system. But if you have it on slightly more direct, yes, you still have that freedom to actually probe the opposition's defense and try to score. So the emphasis on walk the ball into the box is to try and figure out a way to break the opposition's defense down without actually forcing it. Notice that hit early crosses and shoot on sight is actually disabled. Now, this doesn't mean that your team will not cross the ball. They will still cross the ball, but they will not cross it as early as possible. It doesn't mean that your team won't shoot on sight. It would mean that your team is okay. It doesn't mean that your team will not take long shots. They will still take long shots, but they will not shoot on sight. They will not, the moment they get the ball, try to shoot. That doesn't work that way. So if you have this disabled, all these other options are quite open on the table. That's usually what happens, and it's kind of how I like to start the games when I'm playing with the final third. I try to leave everything open so the team can decide what they want to do, and then nothing is off the table. But once you take off shoot on, if you turn on shoot on sight, it means you're not actually trying to break the opposition down. The moment your player gets the ball in a shooting range, he's going to try to shoot, and that may not really be helpful. For some scenarios, if you have a long shot taker, you can actually do that. If the team is defending very deep and then you want them to come out and try to close down your long shots, you can actually turn this on and then confuse them, have them to come out and try to block this shot, and then you can go back to walking the ball into the box. Hit early crosses is just that the moment your fullback or your winger gets the ball in a crossing scenario, he will cross the ball. And if you have a tall striker that is in there early, he can actually go on to win the header before the defenders actually find a way to settle. For play for set pieces, your assistant manager is going to encourage you to do this, especially when you set up your set pieces on Football Manager. They will ask you to do this. What this does is that your players are going to try to win free kicks or win corners more often than they normally would, to try and encourage your team to score from set pieces. So it's kind of what Brentford does in real life. You notice that most teams that play against Brentford tend to concede free kicks a whole lot against Brentford. So it's almost like Brentford are trying to get fouled, or trying to get fouled all the time so they can get long free kicks and then have their players take those long free kicks and then take advantage of their set piece routines. Dribbling and run at defense is quite tricky. For possession-based systems, Dribble Less instruction is going to encourage your team to try and pass the ball without always running at the opposition's defense. Now, notice that if I turn on Dribble Less instruction, if I have a player that is a winger on attack duty, he's still going to run at the defense, because you can see, where is it? Dribble More is already selected for his role. So regardless of what you do here, dribbling less, if you have players in the system that actually have run more often, run at defense, dribble more, they will still dribble. So it means that your team as a whole is dribbling less, but those players in those specific roles have the license to run into the defense and do what they do. So it's easy to confuse the opposition that way. But essentially, Dribble Less is asking your team to try and pass the ball among themselves first, without actually always forcing a run. And usually these things are disabled, so your players can actually do both. But if you have run at defense selected, it means that even players that don't have dribble more, for some extent, they would like to carry the ball and run at the opposition's defense somehow. So even players that may not even know how to run may just carry the ball and then start running. But if you have players that have hold position, like, okay, I have a defensive midfielder here on support duty. If I have run at defense, he is going to start doing something funny, running into the defense like this, trying to carry the ball into the opposition's defense. But if he's set to, defensive midfielder on defend, the whole position kind of locks him down. So all the other players do have the freedom to do as they like, but he, in defensive midfielder on defend duty, is not going to make those runs. Last but not the least is the creative freedom, and this is the part that I like the most. If you're playing in the lower leagues, I like to just leave it blank. Going disciplined kind of helped me. With Atletico Madrid, I did go disciplined for a while, and did help us because we were solid as a defensive unit. It did help us play the 4-4-2, rigid low block with high pressing on the wings, intensive pressing on the wings. So it did help us if you have a collective group that can actually play as a unit and a defensive block. It kind of encourages your team to follow your tactical instructions a lot more. But if you have be more expressive selected, your team, ideally they will follow your tactics, but they will like to do what they know how to do best. It means you're asking them to be themselves a whole lot. So asking your creative players to play in a way that encourages them to use their additional creativity to try and create chances. Most top teams do have be more expressive selected for themselves. So this is the first part of breaking down team instructions the way I understand them, and I'm going to also make a video for the in transition instructions and then out of possession instructions. So I'm going to attach that video much later to this one. I think I'm going to release all three at the same time. I can't really tell, depending on what I'm done with, or whichever one I'm done with first. But that's the video for in possession instruction. I'm going to try to break down the other instructions the way I understand them in a different video. So see you in the next one.